Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm here today with Dr. Candice Waddell-Henowitch. She's an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatric Nursing here at Brandon University. And before coming to BU, she was a registered psychiatric nurse in a few different places, right? Australia, New Zealand, up in Nunavut.
Yeah.
And also here in Manitoba.
Yeah.
Did I miss anywhere?
Nope.
Okay.
That's all of them.
So far, so good. She's worked internationally and nationally on projects and collaborations around things like improving Indigenous mental health, reducing the impact of trauma, and recently you've been involved with a project relating to this graphic novel that you see here. And I'm excited to hear more about this, both the process and impact of what's been happening with this work. So this episode is a continuation of a series we're doing with the Status of Women Review Committee here at BU in honor of Women's History Month. And so this month we're highlighting some of the amazing research that's happening at BU, led by women researchers. And I think you're an amazing person to have on the podcast, so I'm really excited for this conversation. But before we dive in, I know that today's content is going to involve some talking about sexualized violence. And so I wondered if you wanted to just give a heads up to anyone listening about what they might hear in this episode.
Yeah, no, that sounds good, Michelle. Thank you very much. The work that was done with this graphic novel and the research was done with survivors and victims of sexual violence. So although we won't talk about the details of their sexual violence, just talking about sexual violence in general can be triggering to some individuals who've experienced it. So anybody who has had an experience of sexual violence, I just really encourage them to use their self-care mechanisms if they're listening to the podcast, and just make sure that you know what might be triggering and what might cause you harm. But overall, I do think it's a very positive situation, even if the stories of the victim survivors definitely aren't positive.
Yeah, thanks. Tell us about your graphic novel. What was the process like of making it? And also, I'm curious about what you learned along the way, because I know some of your research that's just amazing. So I'm really curious to hear a little bit of the personal journey as well.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, like I said, this was a project done with 10 individuals that experienced sexual violence in universities. So I talked to 10 individuals that had sexual violence experiences between 1990 and 2010. I was really looking for the retrospective experience. So not only what did they experience when they had the sexual violence, but then also how did they cope and get through it, after the fact. So the 10 individuals that I spoke to did a really good job of telling me what they would tell to other people, what they would like others to know that have been through it, what they would like caregivers to know, what they would like parents to know. So when I was doing my analysis, and it was part of my PhD work, so putting all my PhD dissertation together, one of the things that I kept thinking about was, how do I make this more accessible? So how do I do something to disseminate these results? Because these comments from these individuals are so informative and so heart-wrenching and so just powerful. How do I make it more general so that people can see it and people can use it instead of it just going into a manuscript? So that's when I had this idea to do the graphic novel. And first off, I went and talked to Kurt Schultz, who's from the Center for Teaching and Learning here at Brandon University, who has a history of graphic novel creation and comic book creation, and just a very knowledgeable and creative soul. And went to speak to him about, okay, if I'm going to do this, where do I start? Because I'm a psych nurse. So how do I do this?
You don't make graphic novels on
No, it's not. It's not something I commonly do.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd even read one prior to this. So I don't even know how I got the idea to do this. I just know kids and teens like to read them. And he hooked me up with Marissa Mayhew, who is a graduate from BU and a very, very amazing woman. And she helped right from the very start. We got a little bit of funding to make it, and then we just dove in.
Yeah. And so as someone who hadn't read a lot of graphic novels before, what was the experience for you as a researcher, moving your research from like the typical academic publications into something like this?
So I started with Composite Narrative. So I took the 10 voices of the individuals, and then I compiled those by theme to write a story that sounded as if it was in one voice. So the reason I did that was because I was trying to anonymize my participants' information in a way that I could tell the story of of the sexual violence without indicating who was who. Then when we started to conceptualize what the graphic novel would actually look like, we realized that you can't just have someone sitting there talking about their violence and kind of a run-on history because it just is not engaging. So we decided to add characters to this composite narrative. So we split the one voice into 4 different voices, and then we added a 5th character that came in. So what the premise of the novel is that they're at a party, as you can see from the front cover, and they're enjoying themselves. And then they leave to go to the bathroom and they hear a noise off to the side and they witness and intervene in a young person that is in the middle of being assaulted. And then they bring that person into the bathroom with them and then they have a conversation about, all of the different things that run through victim survivors' heads when something like this happens. So, what happened? Was it my fault? What do I do now? How do I get through this? Those type of questions. But they answer in a way that talks about their own stories. So that's how we got those voices of survivors into the book.
And so are the words that are used in the book the words from your research participants?
Yep. So all 4 main characters, I guess they're all 5 of them are main characters, but the 4 characters that are doing the majority of the talking are the words of my participants. The 5th character was someone we had to ad-lib because it just didn't make sense without that voice. So her role, she's the victim, the new victim, and her role is to talk about, was it my fault? So it's to ask the questions that prompt the answers from the victim survivors.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Wow. So I know that you've had a launch for the graphic novel, and I know also that you've made it available for schools. So what was that part like? How is that going, and how are you rolling those things out?
Well, I was really lucky. I forgot to mention that BUSU was involved with the creation of this, and so was the Sexual Education Resource Center. And that was really helpful in the actual creation of the novel because I realized as a 45-year-old mother of a 2-year-old that I don't have a lot of the language that's really accessible to teens or to young adults. I hate to admit that, but, that's something that is the reality of my situation. So they were really helpful in helping me with definitions like consent, right? And definitions of sexual violence itself and adding kind of the implications of technological violence, which is something that I didn't even think about, even though I research in this area. So they were able to really provide some depth to what we call the factoids that are throughout the novel. I also forgot to mention that they were very integral in creating the characters themselves. So who said what, how they said it. We were really trying to break down some of the biases associated with different people and different ethnicities in order to kind of make sure that none of those stereotypical responses were enmeshed in our characters, and they were really integral in that. And now I'm on a tangent, and I completely forget what your question was.
No, that's okay. I asked about the rollout.
Oh, the rolling out.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Sorry, I just realized I hadn't talked about BUSU and CIRC.
Yeah,
so the rollout was really fun. It was a public event where we actually had actors here from Brandon University voice the graphic novel. So the graphic novel was on the stage. It was projected page by page, and the actors voiced the characters. So they sat on the stage covered in black sheets so that you couldn't see their identity. All you could hear was their voices, and at the end they revealed who they were. And I do think that it turned out to be a very kind of dramatic way to launch the graphic novel. And another thing that I have never done as a psych nurse. So it was one of those things where I was really relying on some colleagues over in arts to try to help me to figure out, how do you do this and what does it look like and what do you need, and trying to figure out things like sound and lights and all that stuff that I have no clue about as a psych nurse. And in the future, we're planning to evaluate it. So I'm working with some of your colleagues from education, and we're hoping to get some funding to trial it in a school division to see what the impact of the novel is. So how is it picked up by students, and how is it used by teachers, and do they find it effective, and is it a good resource, and is it something that can be useful? So that's what we're working on, and we're hoping to start that in the spring.
I love that it's become a kind of cycle, right? Like it's not sort of that straight line of planning the research, doing the research, mobilizing the research. But now, this form of knowledge mobilization has turned into another cycle of research about how it's going to be used.
It is. And we're really hoping it's going to turn into a big research project too. Like I said, we're trialing it in a small little area, but then we're really hoping to also see kind of the international impact of this or national impact of this. And is it relevant or would it be useful in other languages? Because this is a hard topic to talk about, and a lot of people have difficulty talking about it in the classroom setting, but it's also a very relevant and important issue because sexual violence occurs the most in post-secondary education. So we really need to be preventing it and intervening appropriately within that stage of life. So where your target age is, it's high school and first year, second year university. So really trying to get those messages out to the people that need to hear them.
Yeah, fantastic. So as someone who's a strong researcher in your field, I'm curious,
I don't know if that's necessarily.
I think you are, according to me. So the theme for this year's Women's History Month is Women at Work. And so I'm curious, kind of shifting from this particular project to you sort of as a researcher. Did you always want to be a researcher? Was this a career you... No?
No, not in the slightest. I started my career as a psychiatric nurse, as you mentioned. So I was in the field for 15 years before I even took the job at the university. And when I first started, I had only ever completed one research project. So, and it was my master's thesis. But then I decided pretty quick that I kind of liked the teaching gig, and teaching new students was something that I really was interested in. And then getting back into the research, or getting into the research, really allowed me to get back into doing something that I really loved, which was advocacy and women's rights and violence prevention. And it kind of all came full circle because when I was an undergraduate student, I worked with the YWCA, Brandon at the time, to create a podcast on, not a podcast, we didn't have podcasts back then, a TV commercial, if I'm aging myself, on dating violence. So at the time, it was my community health project when I was a psych nursing student, and I hired the actors and I got a little bit of funding and I created the video and got permission to use Martina McBride's Concrete Angel song, and we filmed in a graveyard, and it was super powerful, and it was on, I can't even remember what the TV station was here at the time, but it was on the local TV station for almost a year and a bit. And it was partnering with the YWCA. So now in this part of my career, coming back to doing work on sexual violence, and I'm also the president of the local YWCA Westman now. So it all kind of feels full circle, and like I'm doing the work that I'm supposed to be doing, even if I did take a little bit of an odd trajectory to get here.
I love that. And I can see the thread in your research of not just the kind of research advocacy work, but also the idea of mobilizing research knowledge in creative ways. Like you've kind of had that thread weaving throughout, eh?
Trying to, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. From your work, if you could share a message for young women or girls from your research, what would it be?
It would be to not be embarrassed about what happened. There is no guilt on you. And that all of the participants that I spoke to who had dealt with this previously said it's so important to talk about it. That is the most important first step. And one of the survivors said, if the first person you talk to doesn't hear you, then move on to the next. And if they don't hear you, then move on to the next. And keep telling people until someone believes you and trusts you and provides you with the support that you need, because keeping it inside is not helpful. One of the participants talked about how they felt that they had lost 10 years of their life because they didn't talk about it. And then when they finally did start to talk about it, they kind of woke up and said, there's a decade gone. So it's just so important to talk about it. And the more we talk about stuff like this, the more the stigma is reduced, the more people learn to be better equipped to deal with it. So it's just, you just really need to talk about it.
Yeah, it's good advice. What about any advice for parents or caregivers or people in a caring role, educators?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that I struggle with the most with this topic is that there's still disbelief from individuals. There's still a lot of rape myth out there in regards to who can be raped, how they're raped, what sexual violence is, what the degrees of sexual violence are. And I think it's really important for everybody in a helping role or in a parental role or a supportive role to just know that the most important thing that you can do is believe the person. Whether their accused did it or not is not up for conversation. You believe the individual that's sitting in front of you and you provide them with the support that they require, which means giving them choice. Don't make decisions for them. Let them make the decision for themselves, but just be there to listen. As one of my participants said, listen to hear, not listen to respond. And another one of my participants really mentioned how important it is to just provide choice and allow people to have their own recovery, because it's their recovery and it's not going to be the same for anybody else. But the most important thing is listen and believe them. And then that's the only thing that matters, really.
Thanks. I think we should share maybe where people can find your graphic novel, and also because you mentioned about your artist, if there are ways. I know that your artist is... Did they get paid for this, or is there a way we can support them?
They got paid. Yeah. They did get paid a small amount, but they did not get paid what they should have been paid for the amount of work that the project ended up being. Now, when she agreed to work with me, she agreed that this was the budget and this is all that we had, unfortunately, because it was a set grant and it doesn't get expended out.
I know how that works.
Yeah, you know how it works. And she did agree that she felt that was fair, but she ended up doing a lot of extra work. She made stickers. She did posters. She just really spent so much time. I mean, just look at the graphics. It's incredible. So you can find the graphic novel on BU Cares. You can also find it on Busu, and then you can also find it on my personal People page, which is just a Brandon University website. So it's located in those 3 locations. And there's also a Tip the Artist feature. So if you love it as much as we all have, then you can tip the artist however much you think is fair for the use of your free graphic novel. And if anybody wants access to it, it is free, but I do ask that people provide me with who they are that's using it and in what capacity they're using it for, and also if any of it is adapted. On the back, there's a Get Help. Now, obviously, this is for Brandon University because that's where this was located and that's where we dispersed it the most. But this is changeable. So I know some colleagues at the YWCA and Banff have changed their Get Help to their own resources because obviously ours aren't accessible or universal for them. So I just want to know who's using it and how they're using it so that I can just keep track of where it's going.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you so much for sharing about your research and about the journey of coming to it. Is there anything else you'd like to share about it? Or
No, thank you for bringing me in to have this chat, and hopefully people will access it and love it as much as we all do.
Awesome. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.